everybody, my name is the Pineapple Gamer and welcome back to another video. Now, with all the issues of GPU shortages around the world, trying to build a decent gaming PC has become harder than ever before. Add in the fact that used graphics cards have seen a massive spike in prices thanks to the shortages, and also a boom in Bitcoin just makes it all the more worse. So, what can you do if you want to build a gaming PC? Well, you can do one of three things. You can pay a stupid amount of money to a scalper and hopefully get one of the latest generation of graphics cards, even if it costs the earth and you end up paying 3 times the amount. 2. Buy a used graphics card that's been hiked up thanks to the demand. Or 3. Hold off from spending a fortune and either wait till prices hopefully come down for the newer stock and pray that you can get a new one, or just don't bother getting one at all. If you chose number 2, then you're in the boat with pretty much everyone else right now. But what used graphics card should you actually go for? Well, the straight answer would be whichever gives you the best value for money, right? That's where this video comes in. Today we'll be taking a look at an AMD card from 2013 and seeing if it can still be a viable option in 2021. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the AMD R9 280X, one of the best graphics cards money could buy back in October of 2013. It's got 3GB of video memory with a whopping 2048 stream processors, which were no slouch. This card used to go toe to toe with Nvidia's offerings of the GTX 770 and even the 780 in some titles. Back in its day, this would have set you back £300, but nowadays you can pick these up for around 70 quid, which may sound super compelling, but can it still game at respectable frame rates and resolutions in today's modern titles? To find out, I decided to toss this card into my personal rig, fire up a bunch of old and new games, and put this card through its paces. The rig in question has a Ryzen 7 2700X at stock speed, 16GB of DDR4 memory clocked at 3000 MHz in dual channel, with all the games loaded up on a 2TB WD Blue hard drive. With that out the way, let's get into the set of games I tested. I decided to test a few games from around the same time as when the card was released, and then test a few more modern titles to see how it handled them. First up, we have the 2013 release of Tomb Raider. I went into this a little high-spirited as it came out about 6 months prior to the card being released, so in theory, it should have been able to handle this game quite well. Well, I wasn't disappointed. I set the game to the Ultra preset at 1080p, and the card managed to crank out an impressive 83 FPS with 1% lows of 66, so as you can guess, the gameplay was buttery smooth throughout and looked stunning thanks to the high detailed textures. I won't lie, if you'd have bought this card back in 2013 with the intention of playing this game, you would have had an amazing time, because I certainly did, playing it 8 years later on with it. Next, I tested one of Gearbox's greatest games ever to be released. Yes folk, I'm talking about Borderlands 2. After seeing how well the card managed to play with Tomb Raider, I decided to go full ham on this one and just set everything to the maximum. So after selecting 1080p and all the details as far right as they would go, I decided to set about the world of Pandora looking for some natives to destroy. After a couple of minutes, I stumbled across a little spot with a few nomads and psychos and just unleashed carnage on them thanks to the blistering fast 108 FPS this card was delivering. Even when there was giant explosions and body parts flying around, the frame rate only ever dipped down to 55 FPS. But this was hardly noticeable, and it only ever did it once or twice during the half hour or so benchmark run that I did. And if it wasn't for the fact that I had my graph up, I probably wouldn't have noticed it at all. If Tomb Raider and Borderlands plays fantastic, what about Rockstar's GTA 5? Now this game came out around about 2015, so it should have been a challenge for the 280X surely. Unfortunately, thanks to how well the games have been optimised over the years, the card still managed to push out an impressive 75 FPS with high details enabled. Driving around Los Santos was a breeze, and even causing havoc with the local authorities didn't faze this card in the slightest. It never dropped below 55 FPS, even when I was driving around the grassy areas, which, as everybody knows, can be a GPU killer for weaker cards. But this champ took it all in its stride. Now that we've established that it would have been a very good choice card back in 2013, let's see how well it does in more modern titles, shall we? I decided to ease the card into Destiny 2 to begin with, as I wasn't sure how it would cope thanks to its 3GB of video memory. After setting the game to 1080p medium settings, off I went running and gunning round the EDZ, killing every fallen, cabal and taking that game into my crosshair. Now, for some strange reason, MSI Afterburner refused to show up during my benchmark run, and no matter what I tried, it just wasn't having any of it. So I can't give an exact figure on what sort of FPS I was getting. However, I can tell you that during my run, I was getting between 53 and 75 FPS, with it only ever going to the lower figure when everything was blowing up in my face. Most of the time though, the game sat around 60 to 65 FPS, so I wouldn't really want to turn up the details anymore, as we're already on that magical 60 FPS sweet spot us PC gamers crave so much. Also, I think if we did turn up the detail anymore, we'd probably see it drop into the low 50s, even 40s more often than enough. Stick with medium and you're gonna have a great time. Up next, I decided to try one of Ubisoft's new games, Immortals Phoenix Rising. Now, the game's minimum graphic card states an R9 280X should be capable of delivering 30 FPS at 720p low settings. So that's what I went with, and I knew this game was very demanding and could even give a lot of new cards issues, so I didn't want to push my luck too hard. It was here where the cards started to struggle a bit, only managing about 44 FPS when running around and quite often dropping into the low 30s when things started to heat up during fights. Don't get me wrong, the game is still very playable, and even with the lowest settings it still looks really good, so I would personally cap the game to 30 FPS to avoid those dips and have more of a console-like experience. If the card struggled with the last game, I dread to think how it's going to cope with this final one. Last but not least, I fired up Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War and crossed all my fingers and toes that this card wouldn't just set on fire. The game defaulted to the lowest settings at 1080p, as anything much over that caused the VRAM limit to exceed. Surprisingly, this is the first time I've had any issues when it comes to the VRAM, as all the other games I've tested have all been fine and not exceeded much past the 2 to 2.5 gigabyte limit. Once I got it loaded into a campaign mission, I was shocked to see just how bad the game looked, but also how okay the game was actually playing. It managed to keep a respectable 57 FPS throughout most of the run, and only ever dipped down to 39 FPS every now and then, which was a very pleasant surprise. Even though the game was below that 60 FPS sweet spot for a shooter, the game was still very playable, and I didn't notice the drops at all, and wouldn't have probably even noticed them if it weren't for the frame graph. I'm going to chalk this one down to a win. To answer the earlier question, can the R9 280X still game and be relevant in 2021? Honestly, in my eyes, yes. I mean, sure, I didn't test loads of games like Fortnite, CSGO, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Cyberpunk 2077, but as long as you don't expect this card to be a super powerhouse and try to play everything on max settings, then I seriously think that you can still have an enjoyable experience with it. If you're one of those people who play a lot of older titles or esport games, then this card is perfect for you, and it'll still deliver high frame rates and even maximum settings. But if you play more modern titles, then be ready to lower those details or even resolutions, as it does struggle from time to time. Is this the best option right now? Again, it depends on a few factors. Personally, I wouldn't want to spend much more than the £70 for it, even though it can still game relatively well. It still shows its age, and for a little bit more you could always look at a slightly more powerful GTX 780 Ti, which will give you roughly 20% more performance for anything up to £20 to £30 more money. Also, you need to make sure that you have a strong enough power supply, as this thing is quite the power hog, sucking up about 250 watts, so it's not energy efficient at all. So to summarise, the AMD R9 280X can still play games in 2021 as long as you curb your expectations, and if you can find one cheap enough, it might just be enough to tide you over till all this craziness blows over and things start to return to normal, and at least allow you to build that gaming rig you are so desperate to build right now. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful. If it was, then please leave a like and consider subscribing for future videos, or drop me a comment and let me know what sort of graphics card you would suggest buying for roughly that £100 mark. But thank you for watching, and as always, keep having fun.